The road to Hollow End was like a journey into the unknown, each mile dragging Thomas Granger further from the world he knew. The directions were vague, barely more than rumors and old tales passed down by those who dared to speak of the place. The trees grew thicker as he approached, their gnarled branches intertwining overhead, blocking out the sunlight and casting the road in an eerie, perpetual twilight. The gravel crunched beneath the tires of his rented car, the only sound breaking the unnatural silence that seemed to seep from the forest itself. As a journalist, Thomas had ventured into many strange places, investigating stories that others deemed too bizarre or dangerous. He thrived on the unusual, the unexplained. But even he couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that crept over him as Hollow End drew nearer. He had heard the whispers, a village where no one spoke, where silence was not just a habit, but an enforced law. Something had silenced the villagers, something dark and powerful, and it was his job to find out what. The village appeared suddenly, almost as if the forest had been hiding it, waiting until the last possible moment to reveal its secret. The small, weathered houses sat in rows along narrow, winding streets, their windows dark and lifeless. There were no people in sight, only the faint rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant caw of a solitary crow perched on a crooked fence post. Thomas parked the car and stepped out, the door creaking loudly in the stillness. The air was thick, almost oppressive, as if the very atmosphere of the village resisted intrusion. He pulled his coat tighter around him, the chill in the air biting at his skin despite the late summer season. As he walked down the main street, his footsteps echoed unnaturally loud, the sound swallowed up by the surrounding silence. The first villager he encountered was an old woman, hunched over and moving slowly, as though each step required immense effort. She glanced up as he approached, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. Thomas offered her a polite smile and a nod, but she merely stared at him, her face expressionless, before turning away and continuing on her path without a word. It wasn't until he reached the village square that he saw more of the residents. They were clustered in small groups, speaking only through gestures and written notes. A young couple stood by the fountain, their hands moving in a silent conversation. Nearby, an elderly man and a young boy sat on a bench, the man scribbling something on a piece of paper before handing it to the boy, who nodded in understanding. Thomas approached the couple by the fountain, clearing his throat to announce his presence. They looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and fear. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his notebook, flipping to a blank page. With a quick motion, he scrawled a simple question. "Why doesn't anyone speak?" The woman took the notebook from him, her hands trembling slightly. She exchanged a glance with the man beside her before writing a single word: curse. She handed the notebook back to Thomas, her eyes pleading with him to leave the matter alone. But Thomas wasn't one to be deterred by a single word or a vague warning. He thanked the couple with a nod and continued through the village, making his way to the inn where he planned to stay. The building was old and worn, its wooden beams sagging under the weight of years. The sign above the door, faded and cracked, read simply, "The Silent Lodge." Inside, the atmosphere was no less oppressive. The innkeeper, a tall, thin man with hollow cheeks and deep-set eyes, greeted Thomas with a stiff bow. He did not speak, but instead handed over a small, tattered booklet. Inside, in neat, cramped handwriting, was a set of rules for guests, each one emphasizing the necessity of silence. The last line caught Thomas's attention. Breaking the silence brings only pain. The room Thomas was given was small and sparse, with a single bed, a wooden chair, and a narrow window that overlooked the empty street. The silence was almost unbearable, pressing in on him from all sides. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the notebook in his hands. The word curse was still there, etched into the paper in the woman's careful script, and with it, the weight of the mystery that had drawn him here. As night fell, the village grew even quieter, if that were possible. The darkness outside the window was absolute, broken only by the faint glow of the moon through the thick canopy of trees. Thomas lay in bed, unable to sleep, his mind racing with thoughts of what he had seen. The villagers' faces haunted him, the fear in their eyes, the way they moved so carefully, as though every step could trigger some unseen danger. He knew he had to dig deeper to find out what had silenced this village and why. The thrill of the investigation stirred in him, pushing aside his unease. But beneath that, there was a gnawing fear, one that whispered to him in the silence of the night. What if this curse is real? What if it finds you too? But Thomas was not one to back down. He had come to Hollow End for answers, and he would not leave until he had them, no matter the cost. The morning light filtered weakly through the narrow window of Thomas's room, casting long shadows that seemed to cling to the corners. He had slept fitfully, his dreams plagued by the haunted faces of the villagers and the oppressive silence that surrounded them. The village seemed even more somber in the daylight, as if the sun itself was reluctant to cast its warmth upon this forsaken place. After a quick breakfast, a simple meal left in silence by the innkeeper, Thomas made his way to the village's small library, a structure as old and neglected as the rest of Hollow End. The building was tucked away at the end of a crooked lane, its stone walls covered in creeping vines and moss. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, the sound reverberating through the still air. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and aged paper. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old, worn books that seemed to have gone untouched for decades. A single desk stood in the center of the room, behind which sat the librarian, an elderly woman with thinning white hair pulled back into a tight bun. She didn't look up as Thomas entered, her bony fingers busy with the delicate task of repairing a frayed book spine. Thomas cleared his throat softly, reluctant to disturb the silence. When the librarian finally glanced up, her eyes were sharp, almost accusatory. She studied him for a moment, then gestured to the shelves with a curt nod, as if to say, "Help yourself, but don't expect much." Undeterred, Thomas began his search. He moved slowly down the aisles, running his fingers along the spines of the books, searching for anything that might offer a clue to the village's dark past. Most of the books were old, their pages yellowed with age, covering mundane topics like farming techniques and local folklore. But as he reached the back of the library, he found a section of the shelves that seemed untouched by time. A collection of records and newspapers, bound together in faded leather volumes. He pulled one of the volumes from the shelf, its cover brittle and worn. As he opened it, the pages crackled with the weight of years. The records were handwritten, detailing the daily life of Hollow End long before it had fallen into silence. The entries were mundane at first, recounting harvests, marriages, and the occasional dispute. But as Thomas continued reading, the tone of the records shifted, growing darker, more frantic. The entries from 50 years ago were particularly disturbing. They described a thriving village, full full of life and sound that had been abruptly plunged into silence. The details were vague, as if the writers themselves were too afraid to commit the full truth to paper. But the underlying terror was clear. The village had been silenced by something powerful, something that punished anyone who dared to speak. Thomas's heart raced as he came across a name that had been mentioned repeatedly: Elena. The records spoke of her in hushed, fearful tones, describing her as a young woman of great beauty and intelligence who had been accused of witchcraft. The accusations, it seemed, had come without warning, fueled by a sudden outbreak of illness and misfortune that the villagers were quick to blame on Elena. The more Thomas read, the more he became convinced that Elena was the key to the mystery of Hollow End. The records detailed how she had been dragged before the village council, her pleas for mercy falling on deaf ears. They accused her of casting spells and making pacts with dark forces, and despite her protests, she was condemned to death. The final entry in the volume was chilling. It described Elena's execution in stark detail, how she was bound and burned at the stake in the center of the village square, her screams echoing through the air. But it wasn't her death that struck fear into the villagers. It was her final words, spoken through the flames. She cursed the village with her dying breath, vowing that no one would speak again until her name was cleared and her death avenged. Thomas closed the book, his hands trembling slightly. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but there were still so many unanswered questions. Why had the villagers turned on Elena so suddenly? What had really happened on the day of her execution? And most importantly, how could a curse spoken by a dying woman have such power? Determined to find more answers, Thomas sought out the village elder, Jacob, whom the villagers had mentioned in their notes. Jacob lived on the outskirts of the village, in a small cottage that seemed to sag under the weight of years and sorrow. The path to his home was overgrown with weeds, and as Thomas approached, he could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on him, thicker than ever. Jacob greeted him at the door with a weary nod. The old man's face was deeply lined, his eyes clouded with age, but there was a sharpness in his gaze that suggested he had seen more than he let on. Thomas handed him a piece of parchment, carefully writing out his request for more information about Elena and the curse. Jacob read the note slowly, his expression unreadable. Then, with a trembling hand, he gestured for Thomas to follow him inside. The cottage was small and cluttered, filled with the remnants of a life lived in isolation. Jacob led Thomas to a back room where a small altar had been erected, covered in withered flowers and old, faded photographs. At the center of the altar was a single candle, its flame flickering weakly. Jacob handed Thomas a piece of parchment, his hands shaking as he wrote out his message. The note was brief, but filled with a deep sense of regret. Elena was innocent. The curse is our punishment. She will not rest until justice is done. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine as he read the words. The truth was becoming clearer now. Elena had been wrongfully accused, and the villagers had paid a terrible price for their mistake. But what kind of justice could be done after all these years? How could he possibly lift a curse that had held the village in its grip for half a century? As he left Jacob's cottage, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The villagers, who had once avoided him, now seemed to regard him with a mixture of hope and fear, as if they expected him to be the one to finally break the curse. But Thomas knew that uncovering the truth was only the first step. The real challenge would be finding a way to free Hollow End from its silent torment. With each new discovery, the weight of the village's history pressed down on him, threatening to crush him under its burden. But Thomas was determined. He had come too far to turn back now. The silence of Hollow End held a secret, a dark, dangerous truth that had been buried for too long, and he was the only one who could bring it to light, no matter the cost. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the village of Hollow End. As twilight settled over the ancient rooftops, a heavy, almost tangible silence descended upon the streets. The villagers retreated into their homes, closing their doors and drawing their curtains as if to shield themselves from the encroaching darkness. For them, nightfall brought more than just the absence of light. It brought the presence of fear, a fear that had been ingrained in them for generations. Thomas Granger sat at the small wooden desk in his room at the silent lodge, staring at his reflection in the cracked mirror on the wall. His face was pale, drawn tight with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The events of the past few days had led him to this moment, a moment that he knew could change everything. Or nothing. The village's curse was no longer just a story or a rumor. It was a living reality, one that he had felt in the pit of his own soul. The truth about Eleanor, the innocent woman condemned as a witch, and the curse she had laid upon Hollow End was slowly coming into focus. The silence that enveloped the village was not just a punishment. It was a shroud hiding the pain and suffering of those who had been forced to live under its weight. And now, as night settled in, Thomas was about to take the most dangerous step yet in his investigation. He had decided to break the silence. Thomas knew the risks. The villagers' fear of speaking was not just superstition. It was born from real, tangible pain. Those who had attempted to speak over the past 50 years had paid dearly for it, their voices ripped away, their throats seared with an agonizing fire that left them mute forever. But Thomas needed to know the truth for himself, to experience the curse firsthand. Only then could he hope to understand its power and perhaps find a way to break it. As the last light faded from the sky, plunging the village into darkness, Thomas lit a small candle on his desk. The flickering flame cast eerie, dancing shadows on the walls, but its warmth did little to chase away the cold that had settled into his bones. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up his pen and wrote a single word on a scrap of paper. "Hello." He stared at the word for a long moment, the ink still wet and glistening in the candlelight. It was such a simple word, one he had spoken countless times without a second thought. But here, in this cursed village, it held a power that was both terrifying and unknown. With a final, steadying breath, Thomas set the paper aside and rose from his chair. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing in as if the house itself was trying to stop him. He ignored the creeping sense of claustrophobia and moved to stand in front of the mirror, his reflection barely visible in the dim light. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in the silence. He opened his mouth, his lips forming the word he had written, but no sound came out. Fear gripped him, tightening his throat, but he forced himself to push through it. He had to do this. He had to know. "Hello," he whispered. The word barely left his lips before the pain struck. It was like nothing he had ever felt before, an intense, searing agony that ripped through his throat, burning its way down into his chest. Thomas gasped, his hands flying to his neck as if to stop the invisible force that was choking him. His vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he might pass out from the sheer intensity of it. The pain was relentless, growing sharper with every passing second, as though his very vocal cords were being torn apart from the inside. He staggered back, clutching at the edge of the desk to keep from collapsing. His knees buckled, and he fell to the floor, the wooden boards cold against his skin. The pain was overwhelming, radiating out from his throat and into his head, his chest, his entire body. It was as if something inside him was trying to rip its way out, to silence him forever. Thomas tried to scream, but no sound came out. His mouth opened in a silent cry, the air rushing past his lips without making a single noise. The silence was deafening, pressing in on him, suffocating him. He felt as though he was drowning, unable to breathe, unable to speak, trapped in a body that no longer obeyed his will. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the pain started to fade. It receded slowly, like a wave pulling back from the shore, leaving him gasping for breath, his throat raw and throbbing. He lay on the floor for what felt like an eternity, the room spinning around him, his body trembling from the aftershocks of the agony he had just endured. When he finally dared to try again, he found that his voice was gone, not just muted or hoarse, but completely absent. He tried to speak, to whisper, to make any sound at all, but nothing came out. Panic surged through him as he realized the full extent of what had happened. The curse had taken his voice, just as it had taken the voices of the villagers before him. He was now one of them, silenced, bound by the same terrible force that held Hollow End in its grip. Thomas struggled to his feet, his legs weak and unsteady. He staggered to the desk and collapsed into the chair, his hands shaking as he picked up the pen. He had to write it down to document what had happened, even if he couldn't speak of it. But as he tried to put pen to paper, he found that his hands were too unsteady, the words slipping from his mind as quickly as they formed. He forced himself to focus, to push through the pain and the fear. Slowly, painstakingly, he wrote a single sentence. "The curse is real." But that was all he could manage. The effort of writing even those few words left him drained, his vision swimming as exhaustion overwhelmed him. He dropped the pen, letting it roll across the desk as he slumped back in the chair, his eyes closing as the darkness finally claimed him. The room was silent, save for the faint crackling of the candle's flame. Thomas's breathing slowed, his body sinking into a deep, restless sleep, haunted by the echo of his own voice. Now nothing more than a memory. Outside, the village remained as quiet as ever, its residents locked away in their homes, unaware of the sacrifice that had just been made. The curse of Hollow End had claimed another victim, another soul bound to its silence. And as the night deepened, the shadows lengthened, and the darkness grew. The village waited. It waited for the dawn, for the next chapter in a story that had been written in blood and pain. But for Thomas Granger, there would be no more words, no more stories to tell. He was trapped, silenced by the very curse he had sought to uncover. And as he slept, the village's silence wrapped around him like a shroud, ensuring that the truth of Hollow End would remain hidden for a little while longer. The dawn broke over Hollow End, its pale light filtering through the dense canopy of trees that surrounded the village like a fortress. But even in the daylight, the village remained shrouded in its familiar silence, a silence that had grown even deeper since the events of the night before. The villagers, now able to speak once more, whispered among themselves in low, cautious tones, their voices tentative, as though they feared that the curse might return if they spoke too loudly. They sensed that something had changed, something fundamental, but none of them dared to investigate further. In the small, cramped room at the Silent Lodge, Thomas Granger awoke to a world that was forever altered. The pain in his throat was gone, but so was his voice, leaving behind only an emptiness that seemed to echo within him. He sat up slowly, his body stiff and aching from the ordeal he had endured. The events of the previous night were fresh in his mind. The searing pain, the unbearable silence, and the crushing realization that he had become a part of the curse he had sought to break. But even in his despair, Thomas knew there was one final task he had to complete. The curse that had silenced Hollow End had been born out of injustice, and only by confronting the source of that injustice could he hope to find peace, if not for himself, then for the villagers who had suffered under its weight for so long. With a sense of grim determination, Thomas left the inn, the morning air cool against his skin as he made his way through the empty streets. The villagers watched him from their doorways, their eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. They had seen the change in him, the way his shoulders were hunched with the weight of the curse, the way his lips moved silently as if struggling to form words that would never come. Thomas ignored their stares and continued on his path, his destination clear in his mind. The old, crumbling church stood at the edge of the village, its steeple leaning precariously as if the years had worn away its very foundation. The doors were ajar as if waiting for him, and he pushed them open with a slow, deliberate motion. The heavy wooden doors groaned on their hinges, the sound echoing through the empty nave. The interior of the church was cold, dark, and damp, the air thick with the scent of mold and decay. The once grand altar was now little more than a pile of splintered wood and crumbling stone, and the stained glass windows had long since been shattered, their colored shards scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. But in the center of the church, where the light from the broken windows pooled on the floor in a dim, multicolored glow, there was something else, something that drew Thomas forward with an irresistible force. The hidden chamber that Thomas had discovered days before was still there, its entrance barely visible beneath the debris. With trembling hands, he cleared the rubble, revealing the narrow staircase that led down into the darkness below. The descent was slow and torturous, each step echoing in the silence, but Thomas pressed on, his resolve unwavering. The chamber was just as he had left it, small, claustrophobic, and lit by the weak flicker of a single dying candle. The book that he had found, bound in human skin and filled with ancient spells and curses, lay open on the stone slab, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. But this time Thomas did not hesitate. He had come too far, sacrificed too much, to turn back now. He stepped forward and, with trembling hands, picked up the book. The words on the pages seemed to writhe and twist before his eyes, the language ancient and nearly indecipherable. But one passage stood out, its meaning clear even in the unfamiliar script. A ritual, one that could break the curse, but only at a great cost. Someone had to take Elena's place, to become the new vessel for her spirit, to bear the pain and the silence that had tormented her for so long. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as he realized what he had to do. The villagers had suffered enough. The curse had claimed too many lives, too many voices. If there was a way to end it, to free Hollow End from its torment, he had to take it no matter what it meant for him. With a deep breath, he began the ritual, his hands moving over the pages with a practiced precision, even as his mind raced with fear and doubt. The words came to him slowly, his voice echoing in the chamber, though it was not his voice at all, but a hollow, ethereal sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He could feel the power of the ritual growing, the air around him thickening with a palpable energy that crackled like electricity. As he spoke the final incantation, a cold wind swept through the chamber, extinguishing the candle and plunging the room into darkness. Thomas's voice was silenced mid-sentence, but the ritual continued, the words forming in his mind even as his mouth remained still. He felt a searing pain in his chest, as if something was being torn from him, and then a cold, heavy weight settled over him, pressing down on his soul. The pain intensified, spreading through his body like fire, but he did not scream. He could not scream. His voice was gone, his throat raw and silent. He collapsed to the ground, his hands clawing at the cold stone floor as the darkness closed in around him. But even as his vision faded, he felt a strange sense of peace, knowing that he had done what needed to be done. The curse would end with him. The villagers would be free. As the final vestiges of consciousness slipped away, Thomas saw a figure standing over him, a woman, her face obscured by shadows, her eyes burning with a fierce, sorrowful light. Elena. She had come for him, just as he had known she would. But there was no anger in her gaze, no malice, only a deep, abiding sadness and a gratitude that he could feel in the depths of his soul. She reached out to him, her hand cold as ice as it touched his cheek. And then, with a whisper that he could not hear but felt in every fiber of his being, she spoke. "Thank you." The darkness claimed him fully then, and the silence became absolute. When the villagers entered the church later that day, drawn by the strange and sudden stillness that had fallen over the village, they found Thomas's body lying in the chamber beneath the altar, his face peaceful, his hands clasped around an old, withered book. The air was heavy with a sense of finality, of an ending long overdue, and as they stood in silent vigil around him, they knew that the curse had finally been lifted. From that day on, the village of Hollow End was no longer silent. The voices of the villagers filled the air once more, hesitant at first, then growing stronger as they realized that the fear that had gripped them for so long was finally gone. But even as they celebrated their freedom, they could not forget the man who had given everything to break the curse. Thomas Granger became a legend, a name spoken with reverence and gratitude, a reminder of the price that had been paid to bring peace to Hollow End. And in the depths of the old church, where the shadows still lingered and the air was thick with the echoes of the past, the spirit of Elena finally found rest. The curse was broken, her name cleared, her pain ended. And though the village would move on, growing and changing with the years, the story of Hollow End and its silent curse would be told for generations to come. A tale of justice, sacrifice, and the power of the human spirit to overcome even the darkest of fates. As for Thomas Granger, his voice would never be heard again, but his story would live on, carried on the wind, whispered in the dark, remembered by all who dared to listen.